Long before the world heard the word COVID, before lockdowns reshaped daily life and masks became a global symbol of fear and uncertainty, there were private conversations happening behind closed doors, emails and discussions never intended for public view. When the World Health Organization officially announced COVID-19 to the world, it felt sudden to most people. But according to the narrative being explored here, certain influential figures appeared to have been thinking about pandemic-related scenarios years earlier. The focus of this discussion centers on Jeffrey Epstein and his connections to elite scientific circles. The argument being presented is not that Epstein was a scientist himself, but rather that he surrounded himself with researchers, academics, and intellectuals involved in advanced biological and evolutionary studies. The concern raised is not based on one isolated email or statement, but on what some people see as a broader pattern within the documents tied to him. After reviewing portions of the released Epstein files, investigators and commentators noticed extensive communication between Epstein and prominent scientists. These were not portrayed as casual acquaintanceships. According to the material discussed, Epstein funded projects, attended scientific gatherings, and maintained ongoing correspondence with respected researchers across multiple fields. Among the names connected to his network were Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, George Church, and Harvard mathematician Martin Novak, whose work focused on evolutionary dynamics, the study of how populations develop, adapt, and change over time. The speaker suggests this detail becomes especially significant when viewed alongside later events. The investigation described in the text specifically searched for references related to biology, viruses, and scientific experimentation within the Epstein documents. What reportedly emerged was not random information scattered across disconnected files, but what appeared to some observers as a structured timeline of interests and research themes. The speaker argues that these patterns create an unsettling impression, not necessarily because they prove a conspiracy, but because they raise questions difficult to dismiss outright. According to the narrative, several recurring ideas appeared throughout the documents: depopulation, repopulation, sterilization, and immortality. These themes were interpreted as stages within a larger intellectual framework that Epstein allegedly explored over many years. One example highlighted comes from a 2009 email in which Epstein reportedly discussed the concept of engineering toxins. In follow-up exchanges, he allegedly spoke about frequently thinking about toxins and even expressed fascination with the idea of the human body naturally producing them. On their own, such comments could be interpreted as eccentric or theoretical musings. However, the speaker argues that when these remarks are viewed alongside Epstein's broader scientific interests and relationships, they begin to feel more significant. The discussion then shifts to a 2014 exchange involving Martin Novak. Epstein reportedly contacted the Harvard professor about funding research connected to evolutionary studies. According to the speaker, the language used in these emails sounded unusually informed for someone without formal scientific training, adding to the perception that Epstein's involvement in these areas went beyond casual curiosity. Throughout the analysis, the central claim is not presented as definitive proof of a hidden plot, but rather as an attempt to connect patterns, timelines, and documented communications that some believe deserve closer examination. The speaker's overall message is that when powerful individuals maintain deep relationships with influential scientific institutions while privately discussing biological concepts years before a global pandemic, people naturally begin asking difficult questions about coincidence, influence, and intent. The documents reportedly contained a series of scientific terms that immediately caught attention: living, pre-living, virus, infected cell, infected host, parasite functions, growth, and decay. According to the speaker, the wording did not sound like someone casually skimming scientific articles online. Instead, the language appeared highly specific, almost as if it came from someone familiar with how pathogens operate and spread within biological systems. This became one of the key reasons researchers examining the files began questioning the depth of Jeffrey Epstein's involvement in scientific research. The argument presented is that these emails were not isolated curiosities, but part of a long-running pattern connecting Epstein to advanced biological and medical discussions occurring behind the scenes. The investigation also highlighted Epstein's unusual interest in the vagus nerve, one of the body's most important communication pathways. The vagus nerve stretches from the brainstem into major organs throughout the body and plays a central role in regulating immune function, inflammation, heart activity, and digestion. Because of its broad influence over bodily systems, some researchers describe it as a kind of biological control network. According to the files, Epstein circulated articles discussing bioelectronic medicine, an emerging field focused on treating disease through electrical stimulation of nerves such as the vagus nerve. One email reportedly included the New York Times article about hacking the nervous system using advanced technology. A redacted individual allegedly responded to the email with the phrase "lots to do," which the speaker interprets as sounding less like casual interest and more like the outline of an ongoing project. The reason this detail became especially controversial is because researchers later discovered that COVID-19 could affect the vagus nerve in some long-haul patients. Since the nerve is heavily involved in immune response and inflammation control, damage to it was linked to several lingering symptoms experienced after infection. The speaker argues that the overlap between Epstein's documented interest in the vagus nerve and later discussions surrounding COVID complications feels striking enough to invite speculation. Another email from 2009 reportedly intensified those suspicions. In that exchange, a redacted individual allegedly asked Epstein for help exploring the possibility that the vagus nerve could act as a storage area and passageway for pathogens. The use of the word pathogens, referring to viruses, bacteria, or parasites, became a major focal point for people analyzing the files. According to the speaker, the unusual part was not only the topic itself, but the fact that someone appeared to be consulting Epstein directly about such ideas despite him not being a scientist or medical expert. This led to a broader interpretation of Epstein's role. Rather than viewing him simply as a wealthy donor funding academic projects, the speaker suggests the files portray someone deeply embedded in a private network of influential researchers and intellectuals. In this interpretation, Epstein was allegedly helping support or coordinate discussions involving biology, disease research, and human systems in ways that remained largely hidden from the public. The narrative then moves to 2015, when the International Peace Institute hosted discussions focused on global pandemic preparedness. Epstein reportedly appeared on the invitation list for that gathering. Around the same period, Bill Gates publicly warned that future global threats would likely come not from warfare, but from infectious disease outbreaks, a speech that would later receive enormous attention after the COVID-19 pandemic emerged. The speaker's overall argument is built around the timing and overlap of these events. While the material presented does not claim to offer definitive proof of a conspiracy, it suggests that the connections between elite scientific discussions, private biological research interests, and later global events are unusual enough to make people question whether there was more happening behind the scenes than the public realized at the time. For years, Bill Gates publicly warned that the world was unprepared for a major pandemic. He repeatedly argued that the next global catastrophe would likely come from infectious disease rather than traditional warfare or nuclear conflict. At the time, many public health experts shared similar concerns, so those warnings alone were not unusual. What gives the discussion a more controversial tone, according to the speaker, is the connection between Gates and Jeffrey Epstein revealed in portions of the Epstein files. The documents reportedly show that their relationship extended beyond casual meetings or social encounters. Researchers examining the material claim there were formal agreements and organized collaborations connecting the two men within broader scientific and philanthropic efforts. The speaker argues that this relationship becomes more intriguing when viewed alongside the repeated focus on pandemic preparedness found throughout the documents. According to interpretations of the files, Epstein and Gates were connected to networks, meetings, and research initiatives centered around future disease outbreaks years before COVID-19 emerged. The suggestion being made is not necessarily that they predicted a specific event, but that they were involved in circles actively discussing and planning for global biological crises long before the public paid attention to those risks. The narrative then shifts to what the speaker describes as the larger structure hidden beneath the headlines. Public discussions often focused on the social relationship between Gates and Epstein or the controversy surrounding their meetings. However, the speaker believes the more important issue lies in the project's research interests and scientific conversations they allegedly shared behind closed doors. Pandemic preparation, biological systems, and population-related studies reportedly appeared repeatedly within those interactions. One email highlighted in the files became especially controversial because of the wording used. In a message sent to Epstein in 2011, someone allegedly referenced a question posed to Gates: "How do we get rid of poor people as a whole?" According to the speaker, the phrasing stood out because it framed the issue not as solving poverty, improving economic conditions, or helping struggling communities, but as removing poor populations entirely. The discussion deepens when the email chain reportedly continues with Barry Josephson, who allegedly told Epstein he had been thinking about the question and wanted to arrange a conversation about it. Epstein reportedly replied that Gates would be with him in March and available to discuss it directly. The speaker places heavy emphasis on the exact language used in those communications. In this interpretation, the wording suggests something darker and more troubling than ordinary policy discussions about inequality or economics. When combined with earlier references to toxins, biological research, evolutionary studies, and pandemic planning, the speaker argues that the emails contribute to a broader narrative involving population control and social engineering. From that perspective, the files are portrayed not as disconnected fragments of information, but as pieces of a larger framework. According to the theory presented in the video, these documents collectively describe what the speaker sees as a long-term agenda focused on managing populations through multiple stages, beginning with depopulation and extending into broader questions about biology, control, and human systems. At the same time, the speaker acknowledges that none of these elements independently prove a coordinated conspiracy. Instead, the argument relies on the accumulation of patterns, recurring themes, and overlapping relationships that some observers believe are too consistent to ignore. The idea of depopulation is often associated with internet conspiracy theories, which is why many academics avoid the subject entirely. However, according to the interpretation presented here, the concern becomes harder to dismiss when certain themes repeatedly appear within the actual Epstein documents themselves. The speaker argues that these ideas were not hidden personal opinions held quietly by Jeffrey Epstein, but positions he openly discussed among elite intellectual circles. One example comes from cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker, who reportedly attended several gatherings connected to Epstein at Harvard University. According to Pinker's account, Epstein argued against initiatives aimed at ending global hunger and expanding universal healthcare. The reasoning, as described in the discussion, was not financial or logistical. Instead, Epstein allegedly believed that improving living conditions would contribute to overpopulation. Pinker reportedly challenged that viewpoint by pointing to established demographic research showing that higher infant mortality rates often lead families to have more children, while improved living standards tend to reduce birth rates over time. According to the story, Epstein and others rejected that perspective, and Pinker later described himself as essentially being voted off the island, no longer welcomed within those gatherings. The speaker interprets this moment as evidence that Epstein's inner circle functioned less like casual social events and more like a tightly controlled ideological environment. In this interpretation, agreement with certain beliefs was expected, and those who challenged the dominant views risked exclusion, regardless of their expertise or evidence. At the center of those alleged beliefs, according to the speaker, was the ideology of eugenics, the controversial idea that humanity can or should be selectively improved through genetic control. The discussion suggests that Epstein's worldview divided humanity into two broad categories: people viewed as genetically superior and everyone else. Within that framework, the files allegedly reveal recurring discussions about whether some populations were more valuable or useful than others. The speaker argues that this becomes especially disturbing when combined with Epstein's deep involvement in funding advanced scientific research. In their view, once someone who allegedly holds extreme beliefs about human value also gains influence over biological studies and genetic experimentation, the ethical concerns become far more serious. The narrative then shifts toward another area of the files that received less public attention: Epstein's interest in genetic engineering and longevity research. In 2014, Epstein reportedly communicated with researcher Joseph Thoku regarding a scientific initiative carrying a price tag of nearly $200,000. According to the documents discussed, the proposal included genomic sequencing of Epstein's DNA, development of adult stem cells derived from his biological material, and long-term storage, or biobanking, of his genetic samples indefinitely. The records also allegedly referenced experiments involving mutations introduced into stem cells in hopes of extending lifespan or improving longevity. The researcher reportedly noted that the level of work involved made the project highly exclusive and that the arrangement was being offered specifically to Epstein. To the speaker, this suggested that Epstein's role in scientific experimentation may have extended beyond passive financial support into more personal and direct involvement. One particular item reportedly stood out within the invoice: a mysterious initiative labeled the Venus Project, which accounted for the majority of the project's total cost. The files provided little public explanation about what the project specifically involved, which has fueled further speculation among those analyzing the documents. Throughout the discussion, the speaker frames these discoveries not as definitive proof of a coordinated plot, but as a collection of unusual patterns involving elite scientific networks, genetic research, population-related ideology, and private experimentation. The argument being made is that when all of these elements are viewed together rather than separately, they paint a picture that many people find difficult to ignore. The files reportedly offered almost no public explanation for what was called the Venus Project. According to the documents, the only detail provided was that Jeffrey Epstein himself would understand the reference and that the initiative would involve around 200 participants. The vague description immediately fueled speculation. especially because the project's name, connected to the Roman goddess associated with love, beauty, and fertility, appeared alongside discussions involving genetics and reproduction. What made the situation even more unusual was the absence of any publicly available research, institutional records, or formal oversight connected to the project. When CNN later contacted researcher Joseph Thoku for clarification, he reportedly described the Venus Project as only a preliminary concept that never progressed into actual research. He claimed there was no funding and no experiments carried out, though he did not provide additional details. However, the speaker points out that correspondence between Epstein and the researcher allegedly continued long after that explanation. In one exchange, Epstein reportedly threatened to contact the researcher's supervisors if he failed to deliver promised results. To the speaker, that type of pressure sounded inconsistent with the idea of a project that supposedly never went anywhere. The broader argument being presented is that Epstein's fascination with genetics and biological manipulation was not limited to one isolated proposal. Instead, the files allegedly show a long-term pattern of involvement in scientific circles focused on DNA, evolution, longevity, and human enhancement. Epstein reportedly funded elite academic gatherings, contributed millions to Harvard University, and hosted private retreats attended by scientists, intellectuals, and researchers from around the world. The documents also reportedly suggest that Jeffrey Epstein showed a strong interest in life extension research. According to the material discussed, he explored ideas involving blood transfusions for reversing aging, expressed fascination with cryogenic preservation after death, and appeared deeply focused on ensuring that his genetic material would continue existing long after his lifetime. The speaker describes this obsession as going beyond ordinary scientific curiosity. The argument presented is that Epstein seemed captivated by the idea of preserving himself biologically, not just through legacy or influence, but through DNA itself. Some interpretations of the files even suggest he imagined a future where portions of his genetic code could continue spreading through future generations, allowing a version of himself to symbolically live on. At the same time, the speaker draws a clear distinction between documented material and speculation. Claims connecting vaccines or global medical programs directly to Epstein's ideas are acknowledged as unproven theories rather than established facts. However, the speaker emphasizes that several other elements are firmly rooted in the released files themselves, including references to genetic banking, stem cell experimentation, private biological research, and the mysterious Venus Project involving hundreds of participants. What reportedly left the strongest impression on those reviewing the documents was not any single email or isolated event, but the cumulative pattern formed when everything was examined together. Individually, many details might appear eccentric, theoretical, or incomplete. But taken collectively, the speaker argues that they create a far more unsettling picture involving elite scientific access, controversial genetic ideas, and private experimentation operating largely outside public scrutiny. The discussion circles back to the moment when the World Health Organization officially announced COVID-19 to the world, an event that transformed global society almost overnight. The speaker reflects on how dramatically life changed afterward and suggests that some of the ideas found within Epstein-related documents now appear more significant when viewed through the lens of what followed. According to the narrative being presented, the timeline itself is what raises suspicion for many observers. The speaker references a 2009 email discussing engineered toxins, a 2014 invoice tied to the unexplained Venus Project, and later communications involving continued contact with influential figures such as Bill Gates. In their view, these scattered pieces form a sequence that some people believe points toward a much larger story hidden beneath the surface. Still, the speaker stops short of claiming definitive proof of a coordinated conspiracy. Instead, the overall message focuses on the existence of unanswered questions, unusual relationships, and recurring themes involving genetics, pandemics, longevity, and population control. The files, they argue, provide enough material for people to critically examine the connections for themselves rather than dismissing every concern outright. The conclusion ultimately frames the investigation as an invitation for deeper scrutiny rather than a final answer. The speaker suggests that the true significance lies not in any one dramatic revelation, but in the growing number of interconnected details that continue to emerge as more documents and communications become public.